What's the role of time in investing? I came across a podcast by Hugh Henry and one of his friends. He spoke about sort of the different time measurement in China versus the United States or the Western world. Spoke about the Chinese zodiac and the fact that it takes 12 years to turn around versus we have this yearly calendar, things like that. Look, I like Hugh. I like his friends. He's an interesting guy. I think he's more of an entertainer at this point than a hedge fund manager. So let's leave it at that. But he's inspirational, and shout out to his podcast. And I want to take actually this thought, and this is a good example of what I mean with inspirational. He is inspirational in the sense that he made me think about time. Now, I just finished The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. Yesterday was the big formal review. I spoke about this also before, and time is actually one of the aspects I haven't spoken about in the formal review just because again, I mean, this book is it's a thome, it's the human condition, it's everything, so you really have to focus. But I want to talk about time because time is a factor in Thomas Mann's writings. I believe it's obviously because he was operational in the time when Einstein wrote his general relativity stuff, and sort of time became a fourth dimension, space time, and all these things must have been the subject du jour in the salons of the 1920s and onward when Thomas Mann was probably at the peak of his intellectual ability. So I want to talk about time today. How does it affect investing? I think it's a very interesting question. Time is a super important aspect of life, and I think it's worth thinking about this. This is not even on podcast. It's December 10th, 2021. This is Krim Delco. For the day, the fund is up 90 basis points. The market's up 30 basis points. For the year, we're up 28.6%. The market is up 22.7%. We're outperforming by 5.9%. So, by the way, the market's still open. These numbers could change. So, what am I alluding to here? What is time? What's the role of time? And let's first think a little bit about how physics thinks about time. So, we have the space-time concept of Einstein, which is kind of saying something along the lines that we have a deterministic world where things evolve and there are certain paths that things can take. And if you had all the information you need, you could pretty much put yourself at any point in space-time and you could go back and forth. Enter quantum physics, quantum mechanics takes this thing sort of upside down, says you can't do this anymore. I think the multiverse interpretation of quantum theory, in my view, is the best way to explain what we're actually seeing in double slit experiments and so on and so forth. And what we're seeing is that we can't go back and forth, and the reason is because we are in different multiverses. And if we had all the information of all the multiverses, then probably Einstein's space-time interpretation would be right. But I don't want to talk too much about this. What I want to talk about is the concept of time as being and now I want to introduce something that I really find very inspirational. And this is Stefan Wolfram's concept of time. And I think as controversial as he is, as difficult as he is as a person, I think he's super inspirational. So kind of similar to Hugh Henry, isn't probably not somebody I would give my money to manage or my child to be taken care of or something like that, but he's just an inspirational figure, one of those interesting minds. So what he's saying is he's starting with very simple singular automatons or whatever you want to call them. So simple rules, simple little things, let's call them vectors, and they start doing something according to certain rules. And whenever that's something, so let's, for example, you start with a vector and you say this vector will multiply itself by 2, and then if it's bigger than x, it's gonna divide by 3, and if not, then it's gonna divide by 4, something like that. I'm just making this up. What I'm trying to say here is that what Wolfram is kind of trying to go after in his new kind of science and all these concepts that he evolved there is that time is simply the clock speed of when these rules change. So when these rules transform that singular automaton into the next stage. This is kind of how time I think is pretty interesting to think about this that way, because you could then think of time as simply a unit of transformation. So this is how I want to sort of think about this in this particular episode. And now let's talk about investing. And I think the key here is the following. The way I see time is that time is simply a unit of iteration. So if your cost of iteration is very low and you can iterate a lot, then your time gets accelerated, or in other words, you can get more stuff done in less iterations, right? Because you have, you can do more iterations relative to somebody else who has to wait longer to iterate. So, for example, why is the United States more successful than China even today as an economy? It's actually, to piggyback on Hugh Henry's podcast, well, the Chinese take longer. So they take much longer to error correct. And when error correction takes longer, it just takes longer relative to us. We are error correcting faster. So we get more stuff done at the same period of time that China gets stuff done. So what's important here is this is a relative concept now. Time is not an absolute concept. There's no such thing as a clock ticking. The only thing that matters, at least from an economics perspective, is that it's kind of like the cost of capital concept, which is, okay, you need to have some sort of measure that is, okay, this is what I'm measuring myself against. So let's say my measure is the speed at which Silicon Valley is transforming itself. Let's say that's the measure. And that speed is a function of the cost of iteration, which we've spoken about a lot. So in that context, China is slower than the United States, Europe is slower than the United States, and China is faster than Europe relative to that clock speed. If we take the other extreme, let's say time is defined as the speed at which Africa, let's say Kenya, is transforming itself, then of course most other economies in the world would be faster. So in that sense, time, again, to me, as an investor in fundamentally new concepts and engineering practices, is a measure of how you transform, at what speed you're transforming yourself. Now, what is speed? Speed is, if you go back to physics, speed is sort of a dislocation. So you have a mass A going from A to B, and what's the time it takes to go from A to B? It's kind of like the same thing. You're transforming the location of A to B. What is space? Space is the thing that gives you a location. And in that sense, you can also argue that, let's say, time in the investment concept is simply just the speed, is, okay, how long does it take to go from A to B? How long does it take for Tesla to go from having one car to two cars, from having the whatever battery they had to 4680 battery. So in that sense, time, again, is a measure of iteration and speed and error correction. So all these things that we at Orange Capital Partners hold very closely to our investment thesis. This is the key of our investment thesis, is that the cost of iteration, or the speed of error correction, which is the inverse of the cost of iteration. So the lower the cost of iteration, the faster you can error correct, the more you can iterate. That is, in fact, what we consider time. So for us, time, again, is not an absolute thing. We're not measuring that against some sort of month or year. It doesn't matter. These things don't matter. That's why we, these things, when we say, well, we don't care about, let's say, quarterly returns and all that stuff, it really is true, because we don't have an absolute measure of time. What we have is a measure of iteration. So what we care about from an investment perspective is how fast is Tesla iterating relative to other companies. That's the only thing that matters. In fact, not just to other companies, but how fast are they iterating relative to, let's say, the Biden administration trying to stop them, or the unions trying to stop them, or the Germans trying to stop them, or whatever. So you're always iterating against somebody else. In fact, if you take the concept that way, you can say that everything, let's say, take what is the difference between Kamaru Usman and somebody else in fighting? Well, it is, he's faster at iterating. He's getting better faster than other people. Other people can't catch up. Why is Islam Makhachev, in my view, the best fighter in the lightweight division? It's because he's faster at iterating, at solving problems, and therefore he is the champ. The champ is defined as the guy who has the lowest cost of iteration. In other words, error corrects faster, because we're all born with limbs and muscles and brains, and it's a little difference here and there, some genetics, but in the end, it's the speed of iteration that makes the difference, in my view. So again, this concept of time, so it's I think it's a pretty good idea. So I'm very happy about this. This is one of those things where I'm almost on the fly thinking and talking and developing my ideas. Now I had some concept before I started this episode, but I'm pretty happy with this concept. So what I'm saying here is, again, let me rephrase what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that, listen, we don't have an absolute concept of time. Things like quarters, years, they don't matter to us. What matters to us is the speed of iteration, which is, in other words, that time is it's kind of another measure of speed of iteration. So you have a unit of time, and that is defined as, okay, you transform yourself from this state to the next state, which is iteration. So you transform yourself as a company from this state to that state. How long does that take? And that is, we need to find some measure, and let's say we use Tesla as the measure of time. So Tesla is the transformation of Tesla is the measure of time. So everybody else is measured against that. So it takes Ford this amount of time relative to Tesla to change from one state to the other. Now, of course, these are very important questions, difficult questions to answer, because what is a state? What is a transformation? When do we define, like, when is Ford? I mean, Ford is a static company, but it is changing all the time. How is it changing? This goes back, let's say, also to the question, I mean, am I the same person today as yesterday? Well, the answer is yes and no, but what really matters here is not the fact that maybe a few cells have changed since yesterday. You're still the same person, but there is a time when you are a different person. For example, when you change your spouse, when you get divorced, or when your kids leave to college, you do change, or when you have when you get older, or so there's changes that are more relevant. And I think in that sense also, I think companies, let's say Ford and Tesla, relative to each other, how fast are they changing? And this goes back to something that actually Elon Musk said once. He said, my mouth is not some sort of asset or anything like that. It is the speed of iteration, or excuse me, speed of innovation. He said that. This was years ago on a conference call. And I think this actually ties very well into what he said. And I think he would second what I'm saying here. So the concept of time, from an investor's perspective, again, from an investor's perspective, so Orange Capital Partners allocating money towards risk, the concept of time is how fast are you changing, because that is going to define the returns. Now, the returns are measured in years. And that, it's kind of an arbitrary thing. I mean, what is a year? A year is a transformation again. It's when the sun goes around, the earth goes around the sun. That's what a year is. It's a relatively arbitrary measure of time, but that's what humanity has decided thousands of years ago to measure themselves against in terms of times. We measure years, birthdays. It shouldn't be like that. We could use the Tesla transformation as the measure of time. We could use the transformation of American democracy as the measure of time. And so every time Congress changes, that's a year or something like that. Well, I mean, we could do that. I mean, how useful is it? I don't know. How useful is to use the Earth going around the sun and call that a year, and the moon going around the Earth, call that a month? It's relatively useful. It helps in terms of, let's say, you have things like seasons. You know that every January you're going to have the same kind of weather. Those sort of things are useful. But a lot, if you think about it that way, then you can also explain why some people have outsized returns. Because if you invest in a company that iterates a lot faster than the Earth goes around the year, the Earth goes around the sun, meaning it iterates faster than within the time frame of that 1 year, and also if you throw in there the cost of capital, which is the treasury bonds, if you combine all these things, then you turn out to have a much faster growing company, which means faster returns, better returns. So the concept of time, as far as investing is concerned, is now, if we put all of this together, the concept of time is another measure of the cost of iteration. If your cost of iteration is low, then you have a chance to iterate faster than the Earth goes around the sun. And that's one big thing, but you also need to iterate faster than your competition. So if you're the company that iterates the fastest, you will have the best returns relative to all your competition, because everything in economics is a question of competitive response. So having said all of that, now let's put that all together. The cost of iteration is actually just another way to measure time. The lower the cost of iteration, the faster you can error correct, the faster you can transform yourself the faster you go ahead relative to, let's say, the Earth going around the sun, which is the year. So you will have higher returns and measurements, but it's also relative to other companies. The cost of iteration of Tesla is lower than the cost of iteration of Ford. That's why Tesla is more successful than Ford. The cost of iteration of Tesla is hopefully lower than the error correction process that the Biden administration and the unions are using to try to slow Tesla down, or the Germans are using to try to slow Tesla down. So all of these things matter when it comes to returns. So to answer this question now, the initial question was, what is the role of time in investing? The role of time in investing is just another way to look at the cost of iteration. The faster a company can iterate, that is a function of the cost of iteration, the faster it can error correct. And since our measure of time is actually, it happens to be a year, which is just how humanity has decided to measure itself, we are able to have outsized returns. In other words, you want to invest in companies that iterate faster than competition, and also iterate faster than, of course, the 1 year measure. But I think that it's one of the things capitalism has done, which is enabled people to iterate faster than the year, because in the past, let's say, agriculture was kind of stuck in that seasonal, you can only iterate once a year because that's when the corn grows, and then we had the Industrial Revolution. So another way to say what's the success of the Industrial Revolution, we were able to iterate faster than the 1 year concept that we have invented to measure an agricultural society. And I think actually one of the conclusions of this podcast should be then that probably we should at some point introduce another measure of time. Maybe a better measure of time would be how long does it take us to maybe Moore's law could be a good measure of time. Okay, how long does it take us to double our compute capacity? And if it takes us 18 months, then maybe that should be a measure of time. Again, this is very philosophical, but an interesting way to look at things. So to summarize, the role of time in investing is the cost of iteration. The lower the cost of iteration, the higher the rate of iteration, which is along the lines of what Musk once said. Elon Musk said on an earnings call a few years ago that my competitive advantage is my speed of innovation and nothing else. And this is exactly along the lines of what he said. Thank you.